Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa LaRue, and it's such a privilege to be here with you today and to open this meeting. We are having an event of the SVRI Faith and GBV Community of Practice, and this event is being led by Working Group 2, which is a working group that's focused on faith and ending violence against children. And today's webinar is on how to engage faith actors in survivor-led ways. And we're going to be learning from and with survivors of child violence. And it's such a privilege, and I've said this, but I really feel it to be here and in this room today. Morma, if you can go to the next slide. We have a packed hour. So I just want to quickly do the housekeeping. First of all, please remember this webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be shared with the community of practice. It will be available on the SVRI website. It's going to be 60 minutes and we're going to be respectful of time. You will see that you're joining this meeting muted, and we ask you to please keep yourself muted. But if you have amazing bandwidth, you can keep your video on, because then it feels to the speakers that they're actually speaking to people and not just to names on the screen. I want to encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're based, where you work, and what you do. Whatever you want to share in the chat, please do so. And then this session has live interpretation, French and Spanish. So if you prefer listening in those languages, at the bottom of the screen to the right-hand side, you'll see like a circle that says, it looks like maybe a globe with interpretation. Click there and you can choose the language that you prefer listening in. And then finally, we are going to be talking about heavy and loaded things and experiences. This is a survivor-centered and trauma-informed space. And I want to emphasize that and how we listen and how we respond, both in the chat and later when we come to Q&A. And that will also guide how we respond and manage the chat and the Q&A box. But yes, that's it from me, and I'm handing over to Selena right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello, everyone. As we get started today, I'm seeing you introduce yourselves in the chat, but we're going to get a quick sense of where everyone is coming from, and we're also going to practice our poll skills. So I'm going to ask Morma to put up the poll coming up on your screens. Just tell us where you're based in terms of your work. So clicking on the poll that should be coming up on your screens in just a moment, just to give us a sense of where everyone is coming from. Geographically based in terms of your work, just clicking one of those for us. And we're very excited to have such a broad representation. Working Group 2 has a strong focus on the African continent, and that is reflected in its working group members. But we've also been really excited to have people from all over the world joining and giving their perspectives. We're just going to give the poll another moment, and then we'll flag up the results on that, and then we're going to move on. Great. Thank you. It's always nice just to get a feel. We know that people are still joining us, but that strong representation from the African continent is just something that we're really committed to and really excited to see. So thank you for filling that in. We're going to ask you to do a couple more polls over this session. So if we can move to the next slide. Before I introduce our wonderful panel of speakers, I want to just briefly share a reflective tool. And this reflective tool helps us all to think concretely about being survivor-centered or indeed survivor-led. Lisa's already told us we seek to model and engage with this in the webinar itself. And we know that whilst these terms are being increasingly seen in many policy documents, in practice, we also know that many of the organizations or institutions where we work, especially, but not only our faith institutions, may still be quite a long way from this reality. Lisa's going to be placing a question in the chat that you're all invited to reply to over the course of this webinar. And that's just to invite you to reflect on, what does a survivor-led approach mean to you? Do you think it's important? And if so, why or why not? So this diagram shows a continuum of approaches that survivors, and that might be of child-related violence or of gender-based violence, survivors may experience these approaches within their own communities or institutions. And you can see it starts on the left with a denial that survivors even exist, or a silencing of survivors, moving towards being blind to their needs, becoming more aware of their realities, seeking to include them, centering their voices and needs, to finally on the right-hand side, enabling survivors to play leading roles in decision-making around how to prevent and respond. We're not going to discuss this diagram in detail because we want to get straight onto our panel today, but I want to invite you all to take a brief moment to think about where your organisation or institution actually sits on this continuum in practice, in terms of how they might be experienced by a survivor. Morma's going to place a poll up just now, so Morma, if you can put up poll 2. And I want to invite you to answer this question honestly, in terms of where you think your organisation actually is on this continuum right now, and not just what it might aspire to be. So you're invited to click only one of these options and to answer the question in relation to a particular institution that you're connected to or work for. That might be a faith institution, it might not. So we'll just give one more moment for that poll. And just to say, for those of you that are interested in exploring this area more, Lisa's going to be placing a recently published resource into our chat box that you can read, that explores this continuum further and has a particular focus on how survivor-led approaches can only be built on survivor-centred approaches, contributed by the Irish Consortium. So Morma, when you've got a moment, we'll close up poll 2, just waiting for a few more comments. Obviously, we see that people are still joining our webinar, so welcome to you. And then we're going to head into introducing our panel. Thank you so much for responding to this. Obviously, we can see here that there's quite a strong emphasis by organisations in the room of being survivor-centred, nearly 50%. But interestingly, nobody feels that their organisation is yet survivor-led. It's encouraging to see that only a very small percentage of you feel that your organisations are either survivor-denying or survivor-blind, but those realities are still there. 10% of organisations, of people on this call, would actually qualify as really not recognising the existence of survivors or their needs at all. So thank you for that. We have a way to go. So moving on to our panel for today, Morma's going to put up the slide. Each of our 3 women panelists are part of our working group 2, and in their contributions to that group, they have chosen to also speak personally about their own experiences as survivors of different forms of violence from childhood. So Dorcas Motsuadira is a primary school teacher in Botswana. She holds a degree in special needs education, and she also experienced life growing up as a child with a disability herself. She holds a master's degree in biblical hermeneutics, and she's published around disability Christology in the Gospels, as well as writing a fictional story called The Father and Daughter Affair. Welcome, Dorcas. Susie Greco is a survivor of clergy-related child sexual abuse and of domestic abuse. She is currently studying at the University of Edinburgh's Divinity School, and her PhD focuses on ritual practices that impact gender inequality and can be a driving force in men's violence against women and children. Welcome, Susie. And then third and finally, Ogechi Christine Kalu is from Nigeria, but she's currently based in New York. She is a PhD student in social work at the State University of New York, where she focuses on family-related violence and the impact of childhood exposure to this. And this has been shaped by her own experiences. She has also carried out empirical research in Nigeria around premarital counselling by faith leaders. So we're delighted that each of these women have agreed to share with us today, and that they will, in ways that feel right to them, draw briefly on their own childhood experiences of surviving emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, or spiritual violence. They'll also share a little bit about their own work as adults that has been informed by that childhood reality. Finally, they will explore together the question of what faith actors and faith leaders could do to help ensure that children and child survivors are both seen and heard. So just to say, this is a short webinar, it's only an hour. So if it leaves you wanting to hear and learn more, that's a good thing. I'm going to turn to our panelists now. And I'm going to turn first to Susie. Please share a little about your own experience as a survivor of child violence. And feel free to include, if you feel that it's relevant, some ways in which you have witnessed your own faith tradition as complicit or harmful in this type of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. Hello, everyone. I'm really grateful and honored for this opportunity to be here with all of you today, and thank SVRI for bringing survivor voices into these important dialogues, which I hope will inspire positive change and foster a deeper understanding of these issues. So, as a survivor of child/clergy sex abuse, my story starts from what I call the patriarchal vortex. I grew up in a toxic environment, facing abuse at a very young age by my father, who was a Catholic, converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then served as a bishop and other significant ecclesiastical positions, and also by my Catholic grandfather, who was a pedophile and a womanizer. So these early experiences shaped how I saw relationships, and that led me into an abusive marriage later on. So it's important to express in all this, first off, that I am actually grateful for my religious upbringing. The psychological benefits of a higher power, of a God, of a divine being in my life has actually saved my life in many ways. So it's crucial to be honest also and transparent about the church's failings. So these are just a few ways that I feel like the LDS Church has been complicit. So first, we're taught in our church and regularly ritualized in practices and doctrines that husbands are the family leaders and that women and children are positioned under their authority. So looking back, I realize now how these power imbalances in families set the stage for the abuse. I was also taught that my worth depended on my getting married and having children, and that if I did not follow this path, I would be damned. My salvation depended on this. And I truly feel that I was brainwashed from a young child not to think critically. And I was taught to be passive around religious men, and that my worth existed entirely on motherhood and marriage. Although I feel motherhood and marriage are very important, the ritualization and indoctrination of only one path and purpose on earth tied to my salvation was incredibly damaging. Another significant issue in how these abuse cases are handled in the church, and I'll share some experiences further on about this, is that when someone reports situations of child abuse, they do not turn, like myself, to legal and civil authorities for a host of reasons if the abuser is the father and the financial provider in the home, but rather they turn to church leaders. And ecclesiastical leaders are not trained in how to deal with these issues. In the LDS Church, if someone reports this type of abuse, child sex abuse, they're supposed to call a helpline. And this helpline is their attorneys, and they're set up such that the church is the client, and it serves to protect the church and the church leaders rather than helping the victims. So reputable journalists and legal teams have uncovered systemic cover-up by church leaders, enabling abuse and failing to protect child victims. And this has painted a really disturbing picture of the LDS Church that prioritizes protecting its reputation and perpetrators over safeguarding children and members. And the LDS Church is on the denial chart on that spectrum. So these are just a few ways in which I see the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints being complicit in this and not helping abusers. I've had very little help in my journey. So thank you, and I'll turn the time back over to Selena.
Thank you so much, Susie. I'm going to go straight to Ogechi with the same question.
Yeah, thank you, Selena. And so I am from Nigeria, and I kind of like grew up in a family where we're very religious. You know, my dad used to be a very significant part of our community church. In fact, he was one of the persons who built the first church in the area. And he also contributed philanthropically to several community-rooted organizations and events, and even went as far as going to prisons to help people. So he was well respected in the community. And he was actually the abuser in the case of my family. And he would abuse my mom a lot of time. And I was there, the last child of the 5 family, very helpless, very passive, you know, not knowing what to do. And at some point, the abuse began to translate to us, the children. It became neglect, it became maltreatment, you know, and I would go to church oftentimes and I would hear the pastor preach in, you know, Proverbs 13, verse 24, whosoever spares the rod hates their children, you know, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. And my dad would hold on to that. He would, you know, if we do anything, the kind of punishment he gives to us are things related to physical rod. You know, he would take the Bible translation to mean you need to use a hard tool, you need to use a hard substance to hit them. So he would use things like firewood, things used to light fire in campfires. He would use those hard substance or building materials, those hard stuff. He would use them on us, you know. And other verses of the Bible that really project this and, you know, kind of misinterpretation of this Bible verse, like the Proverbs 22, verse 15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline would drive it far away. And then there's Proverbs 23, verse 13 to 14, that says, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with a rod, they will not die. So all of these things further energized, you know, how my dad disciplined us. At some point, I had some cast wrapped all over my arm because he broke my arm at some point. You know, so there were several aspects of misinterpretation of the Bible that was done by several families in my church growing up, and my dad was one of them. And the clergy at the time did not help matters because he would preach and enable these things. He would preach and tell them, oh, if your child is misbehaving, then you're wrong as a parent, you know. And he would say something in the line of Proverbs 29, verse 15, the rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left undisciplined is a disgrace to the mother. So all of these things further boost the energy of parents, and they feel like they should harm or they should use violence to enact punishment. So corporal punishment was one of the ways I kind of experienced violence at home.
Ogechi, thank you so much for sharing those experiences. Dorcas, over to you.
Good afternoon from my end. I don't know where you are. Like it has been said, my name is Dorcas Motswadera from Botswana. Dorcas is a person born with disability, specifically cerebral palsy and visual impairment. And growing up, I would say the violence that I experienced, it comes from nuclear or close person or close people that I would supposed to trust with my life, extending it to the community. Why am I saying nuclear? I mean from a family perspective where I expect love, I expect to be cherished, I expect to be taken care of. But at home, I'm one of the people who, even to a certain extent, even today, there's just that verbal abuse. And why am I specifically saying verbal abuse is because, like she just said, that parents believe in that discipline is the way for them to make a child behave. So for my parents, they believe using verbal abuse is a way of letting the child behave. So verbal abuse, and it goes even to an extent of even mentioning your physical looks to remind you that you have the disability. And as if that is not enough, it extended itself to a school environment where you spend most of your time, and growing up in a place where a so-called teacher, somebody who's supposed to be protecting you, is also involved in that. And then that means if a teacher is involved, obviously the students, they chip in and make matters worse. And it has never been an easy journey, but incorporating it with the issue of faith, I would say, I would overall or just say that faith has failed us when it comes to people with disabilities, because faith believes that when a person with disability is presented in front of a pastor, whoever religious leader, he or she needs healing. And then the healing, it comes in an issue where a person has to stand up, a person has to see if they're blind, or the person has to move their arm if it's paralyzed. And then if those things are not done, then it's believed that there's lack of faith. So now faith definition becomes distorted, because faith, we believe in, it has to be visible, it has to be physical, or it has to be visible. But then I happen to differ. So that on its own has made a church become an environment where it's not comfortable. But then bringing it back into where I call it a fellowship, or place where I call it home, or I call it church, or I call it whatever, which I'm not gonna mention where I fellowship. But I think I found more of a family than where I'm supposed to find family. And you know where you feel safe when you are at your church than when you are at your own family where you are brought. So this thing of blood is thicker than water, in my background, it doesn't exist. It's just a vocabulary that is used or over utilized. So I just saw something on internet which talks about a research that shows different types of violence that people with disabilities experience. And in a research where 70% of respondents particularly mentioned that they experience disability, 70% experience violence, either of verbal, either physical, from the close people, caregiver, relative, a partner who you trust with. Like, for example, 87% experienced verbal or emotional abuse from a loved one, and 50.6% have experienced physical abuse from a loved one, and 41.6% have experienced sexual abuse from a loved one, and 31.5% have experienced financial abuse, which is one of the abuse that probably no one is thinking of. In many cases, we expect people with disabilities to probably, yes, to adapt to the environment, but their financial stability is limited to the type of disability they, or deformed, to use that word if I'm allowed to borrow it. It depends on how they can perform physically. If they can't work, then there's no finances. And then if you find a partner who is probably, you become a housewife, then it's not a safe place. So what I'm just trying to say is people with disabilities don't really experience violence from the community. It's mostly starting from home. So I have experienced it, and I'm talking from experience, but I find a safer place being a church on my angle or on my side. I think that's what I want.
And thank you so much for highlighting, both the challenges of faith, but also that you found a safe place there. I'm going to move us to question 2. Although, you know, I know that the things that are being raised are really deep and heavy, and I just want to acknowledge for a moment your bravery as coming as survivors to this table to help us to really understand the impact of this kind of violence in the lives of children and those children that you were. So thank you. In question 2, I'm going to ask you, and this is only a small question, just share a tiny bit about your own work or research. I know both, all of you have done both work and research as an adult within faith spaces or outside faith spaces, especially in relation to what you see working around ending violence against children and helping them thrive. And I'm just going to ask you, I know that you could all talk for hours about the work that you've done, just to keep it brief so that we all want to email you and ask you to find out more about all of the interesting things you're doing. So Ogechi, I'm going to go to you first to share just a little bit about what you're doing, and then I'll move on to Dorcas and then on to Susie.
Thank you, Selena. So I have gone further to, I opened an NGO in Nigeria, Think Think Africa Initiative. That's one of the things I've done since, you know, understanding that I am a child survivor of maltreatment and also domestic violence. And aside that, I've also come back to do research with clergy. And one of those things I did through my nonprofit after getting a degree in psychological counseling back in India, I decided to do something I called a non-violent campaign for social change. And in this campaign, I targeted churches in the western part of Nigeria, and most of the churches were church that were really well known and renowned in Nigeria, and they were the first to be planted in those regions. So I did go there and spoke with counselors who were in charge of providing marital counseling to families. I chose them specifically because I felt that they had the power to counsel couples, and they're like the people who couples will come to them if they're any form of family violence or they have issues. And one thing I noticed in that situation first was stigma. In the first place, they were like, oh, is she married? You know, how long has she been married? You know, why does she think she has the right to come, you know, talk to us about this situation? And we kind of leveled that with by telling them that I have a master's degree and I've been trained as a psychological counselor. And afterwards, they decided to give me 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes went up to an hour because they heard what I had to say. I counseled them about psychological counseling, how to counsel premaritally, and hearing back from them, they were like, most of these things you talked about aren't what we talk about during our counseling sessions. You know, so the varying difference between what should actually be discussed to prepare couples, you know, gender equality or inequality, tackling power differences as being preached in the community and both in church and both misinterpreted by like verses in the Bible. You know, all of these things were things. I also talked about economical power, financial power, how to reconcile differences amicably, how to reduce verbal abuse, and even sexual abuse was very alarming to them because they didn't know that as a couple, you could also be sexually abusing someone if they didn't give consent to it. So all of these things were things that really shook some of the clergy, and they were very open to learn. I particularly like that they were open to learn. This particular clergy in that study were open to learn. They were very much enlightened, and they did said they were going to meet with other clergy in their region to discuss more about it. So it was a pretty much fruitful research, and I hope to continue to do this across other churches in Nigeria.
Thank you so much, Ogechi. Dorcas, we were coming to you next, but you've disappeared off video. So I'm just going to check whether you're there. If not, Susie, I'm going to come to you, and then we'll go to Dorcas afterwards. So I think Dorcas has just left the room briefly. Susie, can we come to you? And then we'll go to Dorcas.
Okay, thank you. So I'm currently a board member of the Global Collaborative, which is an all survivor led initiative. And I'm also currently a PhD candidate studying practical and ethical theology. So my research focuses on the intersection of religious rituals, gender inequality, patriarchy, family dynamics in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So at the heart of my research is the examination of temple rituals. So the LDS Church has 367 temples worldwide, including 19 in Africa. And these temples are spaces where members participate. Okay, so these temples are spaces where members participate in rituals for themselves and their deceased relatives. So these rituals embody the church's highest theological teachings, including concepts of gender roles and family structures, and that families are sealed together for all time and eternity. And so one of the key aspects I'm researching is how these rituals reinforce power structures within both the ecclesial structures and families as a root driver of violence against women and children. So I draw on the works of Catherine Bell, how rituals not only reflect, but actively shape social relations, and that they're not just about maintaining order, they're dynamic forces that construct and negotiate power relations. So for instance, in the LDS temples, they teach and reinforce through covenants between God and the institutional church that one, specific roles are that a man presides over the family as divinely mandated. Two, the family structure is polygamous as divinely revealed. Three, that the family unit is eternal, meaning that the family should remain together almost at all costs. So if your father is, sexually abusing you, not to report that, not to speak about it, because you would not want to damage your eternal family unit. Yet you don't want to live with this man for the rest of your life, and you can't make heads or tails of any of this. So that's really harmful. So my research aims to deconstruct these ritualized practices and interrogate the pragmatic implications of the polygamous family cosmology, and also bring into context how the patriarchal Christian ecclesial and family model in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as founded on a blueprint that Christ called 12 apostles and a prophet, and they are to rule his church. And this is the model that has to be exemplified in the family today, that they've overlooked the social, cultural context in which Christ worked within an existing social structure to fulfill and bring about his mission. So in other words, Christ taught equality and nonviolence. But could he have created a model that was completely divine in the social cultural context in which he sought to fulfill his mission of salvation and redemption? So I think we need to think about rituals and social cultural contexts in conjunction with science and the pragmatic issues that we're facing, and re-charter a course that creates an ecology of flourishing rather than perpetuating intergenerational harm. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Susie. I think we've still lost Dorcas, so I'm hoping to get her back in. But from the moment, we're going to move straight on to question 3. And Ogechi, I'm going to come back to you. I'm wanting to keep us to time. Just checking whether somebody's unmuted.
Dorcas, are you, Selena, I can see Dorcas. She has 2 connections at the moment. I think that's why there was the feedback.
Would you like to just unmute yourself, Dorcas? And we're just going to ask you for I think it might be on 2 screens at the same time, which is why we're getting feedback. Do you want to make sure you've taken yourself off your laptop? We can't hear you, Dorcas. You're on mute.
Selena, I think for now, move on. I'll message with Dorcas.
Okay, Dorcas is going to liaise with you around the tech. We're just going to move on. Ogechi, we're going to come back to you. And just in the interest of time, for question 3. So the question is, from your perspective as an adult survivor of child violence who was unseen and unheard at the time, can you give us one tip of what you think faith actors could do to help children and child survivors be both seen and heard? So I'm sure you have many, many ideas, but just maybe
Okay.
one idea, just maybe just in a minute. Yeah.
Okay. So first, I feel like the first thing would be education. that would be to educate clergy, because educating clergy would bring a ripple effect. It would bring a ripple effect to family, to children, and also like it would make them aware of certain things that you're supposed to do, and even just make them aware of like, you know, what is right and wrong, and also trying to like create awareness in the community, and also create safe space for children to speak, like create child-friendly reporting mechanisms within the church where children can safely disclose abuse without fear of punishment or retribution. And this may also include things like informal counseling, child advocacy through the Sunday school program, or even like Sunday school teachers coming together to like create an advocacy theme for protecting children. And also, most importantly, to hold abusers accountable, I think, without fear of their position or power. Feel like clergy are very powerful people, and they can do that. Selena?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Lisa, Dorcas, are we back with you? Can we maybe come to you just for
I think I'm
Okay.
around. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, finally, thank you. I had to join with another.
Thank you for making a
I had
plan.
to, yes, because the other one was acting up. I don't know whether am I supposed to answer the third or the second now. That
I think
was
we're just gonna take you to the third question for now. So anything that you feel that faith actors can do to help children and child survivors be better seen and heard. And you're welcome to draw on, you know, your work as an adult just to give us one tip of what you feel faith leaders could do.
okay. I think faith. I always repeat to say, let's have a model where we don't use faith to do what our hearts want as religious leaders. Rather, let's do what the faith is intended to benefit the community. And what do I mean by that? Is right now, I have observed that faith or whatever being a literature that has been in place for a certain religion, it's being used for the religious leaders' benefit, but not for the benefit of the audience. So in that case, when we bring it back to issues of violence, somebody reads the biblical text for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the audience. So somebody instill or practice violence on the people because it benefits. As much as it says spare the rod and spoil the child, it doesn't mean kill the child. It just says let the child know the knowledge and be able to be disciplined and be a responsible future adult. But now it turns out to be used for our own benefit as an individual who is a religious leader. So in that case, we use it for our own purpose. So I think let's interpret biblical texts, or not just biblical, but just religious documents in the benefit of the audience, not for our own as leadership.
Thank you so much, Dorcas. And I know you could, if we had time, tell us a lot more. I know you were inspired yourself to become a teacher in the light of those bad examples of teachers that perpetuated violence. So we're really excited to see how your talents are coming into play to be a different kind of teacher. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to go briefly to Susie for one final comment on question 3, and then we're going to open it up for an interactive discussion. So those of you that have comments or questions, I've seen the chat's been very busy. You're going to have a few minutes to share those in just a moment once we've heard from Susie.
All right, thank you, Selena. So I think clergy who are not trained in these issues need to work hand in hand with NGOs who can train them and help them and have resources. So there needs to be an overlapping of connection where the churches may lack resources. And this should be mandatory training, whether it's women or men, they need to have that. But I want to share a personal experience here. So the LDS Church is on the, survival denial experience, and we're not even acknowledging and I'm going to tie this into their theology. So hold on. So I was invited to attend events to initiate the World Day for the Prevention of Healing from Child Sexual Exploitation, Abuse, and Violence on November 18th, which was passed by the United Nations. So I reached out to my church for support, meaning someone would attend with me at these events. And I was told I was lucky to attend by myself. So after persistent requests, many, many requests, they sent a couple to represent the church to come to one of the events. This couple did not even talk with me. They were at the events and they said some prayers, but they never even looked at me. They never, well, maybe they looked at me, but they never came up to me, acknowledged my presence. You're in our church. There was no there was no interaction. And this really left me feeling isolated and unsupported, especially compared to other faith groups that were there. They had robust survivor programs. This is very difficult. I had to pay my way there. So many sacrifices I made there to kind of get our church in the game. And they have not supported me at all in any of this, except for one person. And I'm not going to name names, but I look up to this male ally a great deal for having supported me through this. So in discussing the LDS Church approach to these sensitive issues, it's important to highlight that the LDS Church puts significant emphasis on families, youth, and children and the rising generation, but it provides no services to victims of abuse, silences victims, lobbies against legislation for mandatory reporting, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't. So this raises serious questions about how the LDS Church can involve better practices to align with their Christian principles of compassion and justice, particularly in the eyes of the younger members who are increasingly aware of these issues. My daughters have all seen how I have been treated in the church, and that has affected their faith tremendously. So churches need to engage more effectively with survivors and ensure accountability for perpetrators and foster a safer environment for all members, especially children and youth. Okay, that's all. I could go on and on, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to extend a thank you to all three of you. I know that if we had more time, there's so much more that you can say. And if there are important things you feel you haven't had the chance to, because I'm aware you're offline for a little bit, please post those comments in the chat. You'll have seen the chat is really commenting a lot. And I just want to highlight that our gratitude at being able to see you and to hear you. We're so aware that this so often fails to happen in our churches, in our religious communities, and also the enormous pressure that is placed on survivors to be the ones that are doing all of the work and doing all of the pushing. So I want to take us into a very brief conversation now. We haven't got long, but I want to invite all participants attending this webinar to reflect briefly on the question, what stands out to you from what you have been hearing from the panel and why so? I'm aware that this has been happening already in the chat, but this is a brief opportunity to do that. I want to highlight that as part of our commitment to being survivor-centered, trauma-informed, we want you to refrain, even though there are many survivors on this call, from beginning to share your own story. We won't have time to do it justice, the justice that it deserves, and we ask that we therefore confine our conversation to the stories that have already been shared in this panel today. So just bear this in mind and strive to be trauma-informed and survivor-centered in comments you make or questions that you raise. And the aim of this is to be an interactive discussion and not to put our panelists on the spot by asking questions that they may not wish to answer. Please use the chat box, but also put your hand up or just unmute yourself and make a comment. We ask you to keep the comments brief so we can hear from as many people as possible just for the next five to 6 minutes or so. And we appreciate all the conversation that's been happening in the chat itself. The floor is open.
Selena, seeing that there is a moment that I can step in the Q&A, I just want to raise your just a couple of points that were raised. This isn't really now responding to the question that you posted, but Malamita posted quite early on which people in community help you to have an advisor to access for response. So what I understand from this is if the panelists could share, who were the people that supported you? Who did you turn to and did respond? And then Noor posted 2 comments around, the need for this kind of research and this kind of engagement in Muslim settings and in Muslim families as well. It has been quite a Christian discussion today and the need around that. Again, not so much a question, but I just wanted to flag that in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm just going to leave it open or invite you to put a question in or a comment in the chat or in the question and answer section. And then I'll hand back to our panelists if there's any comments that they want to make. But I'm just going to give a moment more for the chat. I can see there's lots of different comments being made here. But an opportunity, if anybody does want to unmute themselves and ask something or say something, this is your moment. So I'm seeing in the chat box, in response to the question, what stands out to you from what you've been hearing from the panel and why? Mary's saying the reality of child abuse and the need to speak out against it. Danira is saying what stands out to me is the amount of work we need to put in as survivors, despite the harm we've already been through. Thank you for sharing that. And that pressure on survivors to be the only ones doing the work is deeply problematic. Modupe highlights that she feels that there's no justice for victims within our religious institutions. And Sabrina highlights that she feels we still have a lot to do to prevent these kinds of violence. Regina highlighting that there's a call to support survivors in the church, but that we also need to build the capacity of our faith leaders to effectively respond to gender-based violence in the spaces that we are already in. Miriam highlights that the willingness of leaders in Nigeria, as Ogechi was highlighting, the leaders being willing, the faith leaders, that this provides motivation to focus on involving these influential stakeholders to address violence and abuse. And Saida highlights one of the things that stood out to her is the way in which faith can be misused as a vehicle to practice abuse. Oh, and now, sorry, it's jumped. I've jumped off. So yeah, notions of allyship, survivor-led approaches, that many religious leaders actually have their hands stained, Modupe highlighting there. Regina saying we need to empower young people in the churches to speak out against violence, not only to church leaders, but broader than that. And Lisa, I see you've got your hand up. Over to you.
I've been monitoring the Q&A box, which is a different one. Nobs posted a question that if the panelists could respond in the chat box, but I looked at, I think there are people just in the room that can also respond. She asked, are there resources that can be shared to aid correct interpretations of religious texts? And if I looked at everyone introducing themselves, there are many organizations here that have been working on programs, on interventions, and on a documentation to support such correct or better guided interpretations of religious texts. So if anyone, especially our speakers, have links that you can post in the chat box, that would be great. And then Akinola from Elijah from Nigeria just posted a question is, how can we bridge the gap between harmful cultural practices and religious mantra that encourages these violences? Yes, that's everything there.
Thank you. And I've also seen Dorcas highlighting some of her work that she does there. Thank you so much, Dorcas, for placing those things in there. So really important comments coming up in the chat. Vesta highlighting organizations must be intentional to tailor their interventions to survivors and survivor needs. And I think a gratitude to the panel being open to share and being resilient. Nontando putting something in the chat about contextual Bible studies, which can really be a tool So there's a number of resources there. So thank you so much. I'm very aware that we've only sort of got to the tip of the iceberg here, but I'm going to move us on just to invite our panelists. I'm not going to come back to each of you, but if there's any responses you'd like to make to any of those questions, please do type those into the chat, as I want to move us into our final poll and starting to wrap up. Lisa, unless there's anything else you've noticed in the chat or the Q&A that you want us to pick up, I'm going to move us on. Okay.
All good.
Great. Thank you. Uwezu from Tear Fund places some key resources developed by Tear Fund. Thank you very much. Morma, I'm going to ask you to put up the next slide, please. Also some resources from World Vision. So if you're excited by what you've heard from our three panelists today, excited, but I think also moved and convicted about the realities of this experience for survivors, you'll be interested to hear that Dorcas, Ojiche, and Susie are just 3 of 30 peer contributors to our course, Faith and Helping Children Thrive Without Violence, which we are piloting as a main focus of Working Group 2. So I actually met all 3 of these panelists through the contributions which they've recorded for this course, and just 3 of over 30 contributions from around the world. So our application process is out, there's a link there, but we're actually already massively oversubscribed for our pilot course, which is going to be kicking off in March and running for 10 sessions. We'd really like to know if this course is something that people are interested in, so we encourage you, if you're interested or you know someone who's interested, please fill out the application form, but click the button that says you're willing to attend it at a future time. It helps us to see that there is a need for this kind of course, and we'll be reporting back a little bit once we obviously see how our pilot goes. But I've been incredibly moved by these 3 particular stories, and the link will be in the chat to find out more about that particular course. So as we wrap up today, we'd love to get a little bit of final feedback from all of you. I can see people are posting things in the chat already, but we're going to ask you to just take a moment to reply to our final poll for this session. So Morma, I'm going to ask you to put up poll 3, or continue to place some comments in the chat just as feedback for our panelists. I'm sure it's incredibly vulnerable to share from your own experience, and we would really love to hear and to understand a little bit. So in poll 3, we'd ask you to think about the question, what did you find most meaningful about this webinar today? And to select your top 3 only from this longer list. So you should be able to click 3 buttons and just spend a little bit of time. I'm going to give you a little bit of time in this poll just to reflect on what stood out to you from this webinar. So I'm noticing Anne was just saying she's made a comment in the chat, which I think she'd like us to read. So it's saying research has revealed a gap in knowledge on the different forms of violence and the intersectionality with other factors amongst ordinary people who usually lean on religion and culture, including rituals, to perpetuate violence. Therefore, more training and a community-based approach to addressing violence might be helpful. And I think we very much seen some of those different intersections discussed by our panelists today, but also those underlying drivers in our family structures. So 2 of the things that I'm leaving with personally are ways in which faith-based structures, particularly churches, seem to ordain in certain kinds of ways, certain kinds of family structures, particularly a power hierarchy for men in that structure, which has very negative implications at times for women and children. And the importance of our faith structures being held accountable and holding perpetrators within their space accountable. Thank you, Morma. I'm just gonna enable people to have a little bit of a look at those comments. Just a final appreciation to our panelists. 66% really highlighting those personal stories of our three panelists as being really significant, and their insights on what faith actors can do to create supportive systems. So we see that this topic, where we haven't talked about being survivor-led, we've attempted to create a webinar where survivors and their voices and their opinions and their ideas and their insights have led our webinar, and where we tried maybe to be a little more honest about where we might be and where our organizations might actually be on that continuum and its tool. So I want to appreciate all of you for participating, for spending your time with us today. This video, this webinar has been recorded. It will be made publicly available. So we do encourage you to circulate it to other people that you feel may benefit from this. And I'm just going to hand back to Lisa now to wrap up our session for us.
Thank you so much, Selena. Everyone, please take a look at the chat box. The link is there if you want to sign up to do the course in future. The link is there if you want to sign up to become a member of the COP, or also a link for the COP's webpage on the SVRI website. I think that's everything posted there. Susie, Ugechi, and Dorcas, this was incredible. Thank you so much. Just for this gift that you gave all of us in this session. I think so many of us, we do this kind of work every day, but it's a gift that you give us to share your stories and your experiences and your learnings. And we cannot honor you enough for that. Thank you. Selena, thank you for organizing this. Thank you so much. And Morma, who organizes all of the tech all the time. Morma, we would be lost without you, and this would be a total mess. Thank you so much to Working Group 2 for the work that you're doing around faith and violence against children. I'm so excited about this course. It's going to be amazing. And everyone who joined today, thank you so much for joining, for your presence here. And let us continue these discussions in this kind of survivor-led way. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.